So thank you everyone for coming and persisting with the conference. We appreciate your participation today. I'm Glen Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel with some exceptional speakers, and we'll be continuing our assessment of the policy implications for the U.S. and allies of the war in Ukraine and how it's affecting the situation there. We have a lot of brain power here on this panel, senior policy experience of individuals, two of whom are Jamestown board members, I'm very proud to say, and we're just delighted that they're here today. Our first speaker will be retired General David Stillwell, came all the way from Hawaii to participate in this discussion today. He has had many senior level positions in the U.S. government, and working in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and also working previously at the State Department, where he was a former Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And then he will be followed by our next speaker, who will be Miles Yu. If you're not familiar with Miles, you haven't watched Ambassador Pompeo enough, or Secretary of State Pompeo enough. Miles has been a leading advisor at the State Department, where he worked under Pompeo, advised him on his Asia policy. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He is also taught a professor of East Asia and military naval history at the U.S. Naval Academy in Maryland. And so he worked there, as I mentioned, as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And so he's worked all over Asia in many different capacities. But he, most importantly, he has a doctorate from University of California, Berkeley. So I don't know whether to congratulate him or feel sorry for you, Miles, surviving Berkeley. But anyway, that's quite a lot. I'm also delighted to be able to have as our speaker Mike Vickers. Many of you are not familiar with Michael, but he served in many different Republican and Democratic administrations. He was an operational strategist for two great wars of our time, which is no kidding, the war in Afghanistan and the effort to drive out the Soviets. That's a very key part of his bio and what he did in accomplishing that. The other part was taking down bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and that is something certainly we need to look forward to in reading in his memoir that is coming out shortly. And so I'll let Mike mention the dates and names of his memoir when it's coming out. Now, we wanted to ask all these policy experts to describe their views and perceptions about ways of what the war in Ukraine means for deterrence and how we look at Taiwan. So I'm going to turn the floor over to General Stillwell and David and let him he's been thinking about this a lot, and he's also, because he's an advocate of air power, I do want to hear what he has to say about the air power implications. So take it away, Dave.
Thanks. I'll try to get this about 10 minutes done, and really want to hear your thoughts and questions. So I'm going to focus on what we can do with allies, partners, like-minded folks that we haven't been doing. All along, these conversations are basically confined into two areas. One, what the U.S. can do unilaterally, and two, military, things that blow up, and kinetics. And I want to expand it from not just U.S., but we have this wonderful gift, and we have this like-minded and universal sort of approach to relations and governance that the PRC frankly doesn't have. Their allies are North Korea and Pakistan. So how do we leverage that to our best use? And then the second part is take this out from American strength of simply the military, bombs and bullets, and go to, if you haven't seen this book, Political Warfare by Carrier Shannock, he talks about how the PRC is trying to win without fighting by using its economic, information, political, et cetera, levers. But we have advantages here too that we have not been using to date. So again, that's the approach I'm going to try to take. I was in my boss's office back in the day, and he suggested we do this one thing approach to boosting Taiwan's position in the world and making sure that PRC understood our commitment. And when he suggested this particular thing, I said, well, boss, you know that means PRC has stated they're going to go to war if they do that. And if he had an ashtray on his desk, he would have thrown it at me. He goes, you're my China guy. You don't understand that we're already at war? They are fighting us with everything they have. They just haven't launched the boats and the missiles and all that stuff. And he's right. Look at what they're doing economically and information in Taiwan and in the U.S. and elsewhere. And so that was a pretty nice wake-up moment for me. And again, from that, I hope to share some thoughts on that. I went to Europe for the only time in my entire life in uniform in 2011 in Capstone. And I went to 6 countries, and every single one of them we asked, my European friends asked, why aren't you spending your commitment of 2% to be a member of NATO? That's an entry fee, that's not a cap. And they're going, well, it's hard. We've got social programs and all that stuff. And then their next line was always, but we're worried stiff about Moscow. And I'm going, well, and so we missed the opportunity to deter the Russian invasion of Ukraine because a lot of our NATO partners were not putting out a deterrent posture. I think that's also something we need to learn for how we're setting ourselves up for success in the region. I think we're in much better shape in the region, one, because we don't have that 2% line, but we also have countries like Japan and others who have really come on strong, and they understand this is as much in their interest as ours. So I'm going to talk about 3 things: traditional allies, 5 bilateral allies in the region, right? Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, and Thailand, and then non-traditional, or not allies, but partners who do effectively alliance work, like Singapore, Vietnam, and even India in some cases. But third, I'm going to talk about non-standard partners, countries we don't think of as partners, but that we should, that have the ability to also advance our interests, which we consider universal in the region and the world. And I'll finish up with recommendations, because otherwise I'm just wasting your time. Traditional allies. I was just going to finish my presentation right here by saying Japan, and dropping the mic and walking away. Who would have thought 5 years ago Japan would be where it is today? I'm going to take some credit of that because my solid hairline and my rugged good looks, but it has nothing to do with me. It started in 2010 with the advent of the DPJ and then the Senkaku incident in September of 2010, where a small contest between a trawler and a Coast Guard ship turned into a major economic war while we banned rare earth minerals and all that stuff. That's what brought the LDP back, that's what brought Abe back, and that's what really, we talk about the PRC being so strategic. What a gross error. You basically had Japan in your pocket, and they frittered it away. Again, as my old boss would say, in a lot of cases, our best ally is a Chinese diplomat. This is a case where they had everything going their way, and they messed it up. So, ROK, in this last joint statement with Korea, we actually said Taiwan Strait, and they said that they have interest in Taiwan Strait. That's a first. And then the Yoon government has also abandoned a lot of the unhelpful policies from Moon Jae-in, and why not? Look what they did with Lotte in China, and the THAAD, and Yodo, when they did the Air Defense Identification Zone announcement. North Korea, what China does to support North Korea that works against South Korean interests. So these are all things that, again, we don't have to push real hard. These things are out there, and we just need to keep them in mind as we work with our allies and partners. The one I like the most is the Philippines. Scarborough. Again, our performance hasn't been consistent, but we have, encouraging the Philippines to take the PRC to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, and the subsequent award in 2016 was just slick. It was magnificent. The lawyers handled it well. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea it came to the right conclusion. And the one thing that was missing was a U.S. line of support. In 2016, the U.S. went silent on that. And so, I'm going to foot stomp this, in 2020, in July, the United States official policy changed to say that we do not recognize China's 9-dash line claims. We need to keep saying that. If we don't keep repeating that policy, that people forget about it. So that is official policy now. China's maritime claims are bunk, and we go with the traditional 2,000-mile EEZs, and the Philippines appreciates that. Australia, new government, yet to be seen where they're going to go, but the Scott Morrison government was fantastic. The Turnbull government is the one that started that change with, if you've seen the book Silent Invasion and what John Garneau and others have done, basically to take what is going on in our country and show as a model what you should be looking for, what we should be looking for elsewhere. So, I do believe Australia will stay the course on that, and they, again, will remain. You've got Darwin, Tyndall, all those activities where we have U.S. forces access and presence there. Those are fantastic. So I'm going to terminate there. I'm not going to talk about Thailand. We'll figure out how to deal with that. But I will talk about one thing that the chairman that I worked for, Martin Dempsey, talked about, is to date, the alliance relationships in Asia and elsewhere have been hub and spoke, with the U.S. in the middle and all of our allies, partners. Basically, we're insisting they look to us for the cues, and then we all march off together as bilateral. And what Japan has done and others in the region on a networked approach is absolutely fantastic. And now we've got the Quad, we've got AUKUS, we've got a number of other things that show you what a networked alliance structure looks like. These are all to our advantage. We're maximizing the efficiency of these individual countries. We're leveraging their shared interest, and we're leveraging our shared mindset on how to get at this. So we need to make sure we stay on that. Number two, non-traditional, non-alliance partners, but partners nonetheless. Obviously, Singapore is one. I want the Straits of Malacca to become a one-way gate. American military ships cannot go westbound through the Straits. They can come eastbound all the day. I'm very proud of DOD in this last with Ukraine that we did not do what we always do, is raid PACOM and send all PACOM assets into the Arabian Gulf, the European Reassurance Initiative and all those things. We stayed the course, and we let Europe deal with the European problem while we supported from something of a distance. That's got to continue. But Singapore is a major part of that, and their posture with our relationship militarily might as well be a security alliance. I hope I don't get them in trouble by saying that, but it is very productive and useful. We need to get our friends and allies to stop this "don't make us choose" language. There's a clear choice, and not choosing is hedging, and that doesn't help. So I wish they would come off of that posture. India is another area of great opportunity, but like we learned under the Ash Carter Defense Department, India will go at India's pace. And then this takes us back to the networked approach in dealing with India. Sometimes the U.S., when we step into the room, we actually are our own worst enemy. We don't know when to stop talking, like me right now, and we need to listen more. That's the essence of diplomacy. I got two ears and one mouth. We should go at it with that approach. And I think if we do that with India, and especially with Chinese missteps on the shared border and other things, we have opportunity there that we can continue to use. Pompeo went to India in October 2020 during the pandemic, and a fantastic trip. And we did 2 Quad ministerials with India, while Pompeo did that set up the summit. So I think there's an opportunity there. And finally, Vietnam. This is one where you don't want to talk about it too much, but our interests and Vietnam's interests are 100% aligned. There's the unfortunate issue of the name Communist Party, and then that is a connection with Beijing, which isn't all bad. But look at the 2,000 years of history with Vietnam, and then you look at what we bring, and there's no doubt. And frankly, that relationship has been nothing but productive. So we'll go to number 3, non-traditional. We'll start off with Taiwan. Again, the discussion this morning, Senator Cotton's words and all that stuff, yes, we need to rethink how we talk about Taiwan and how we think about Taiwan. I compare it to, the PRC information operations, its influence operations are really good in many cases. They use this language, U.S. needs to be reasonable, you just need to meet us in the middle. Just meet us in the middle. I love that language because what it says is that the relationship has been tipped heavily in the U.S. favor all along, and now we just need to get it back on an even footing, which denies the obvious. Their assumption is that the relationship's here. Frankly, the relationship is here, very much in favor of the PRC. We've been giving away Taiwan interests as trade space for the last 40 years, and we need to right that ship back to here. So instead, what China would have us do is give just a little bit more here, and everything will be okay. Well, after 40 years, we have to acknowledge that's not the case, and we have lots of room to do things with Taiwan that we haven't done, things that we agreed to, and we are self-censoring. Others, Central Asia. Nadej Roland wrote a fantastic piece on Central Asia, American interest, Japan interest, and Korean interest. Lots of infrastructure investment in Central Asia. And then you look at what the PRC has done with its One Belt, One Road, driving right through the Russian sphere of influence. You think Russia's testy about Ukraine. Imagine how they feel about the PRC setting up shop in their other sphere of influence in Central Asia. And this is an area of opportunity that we should exploit. Not just there either. I think Sri Lanka is going to open up here real quick. Post-Rajapaksa made the deal with the Hambantota port. Like Africa, I think the Sri Lankans are going to realize they made a bad deal. We can come in as a quiet partner and I think help them right that. 2 more on that. 17+1. This is a personal gripe. The 17+1 Eastern Europe. This is the PRC making a deal with, was Lithuania. They backed out. I asked my European friends, when are you going to pull out of this thing? Because they all say there is nothing to it. It's just a bumper sticker. And they say as soon as someone does. Well, Lithuania has done so. So all the rest of you, face the facts. take advantage of this opportunity and deny that. And then same thing with Africa, and that's happening. The Africans are rolling back. You've seen this thing with Malawi where the PRC are making fun of Africans, and that's just unthinkable. All right. So those are the three areas I just want to talk about. And so I'll wrap up by one, all that was to admire the problem and set up what I'm suggesting next. I thought General Cotton's comments this morning about Ulysses Grant to his generals is, again, don't tell me what they're going to do. Tell me what you're going to do. Here's what we should do. First off, reassess strategic ambiguity. This task was given to me when I was at State. And I like doing things in a hurry, but I did not want to do that one in a hurry. Because I think of Dean Acheson and where we drew that line. And where do you draw that line if we're going to talk about at least geopolitical strategic ambiguity? Jinmen? Are we going to talk about Jinmen, Matsu, Ponghus, Pradas? Where are we going to draw that line? Let's not rush into this. Let's think about what that's going to look like. Second one. So the first one, reassess this concept, and again, but don't do it in a rush. Second one is coordinate our Taiwan policy with our allies and partners. I would ask my Korean friends, Japanese friends, and others, what's your Taiwan policy? And they were surprised that anybody actually asked. They all have their own policies too. So when we coordinate this, when we start revamping this, let's do it in conjunction with. Let's hear what they're thinking. Again, we know where Japan's at. Look, when the Senkakus go, the Ryukyus are next. I had a poster I picked up during the anti-Japan protests in 2012 in Beijing, and it says, take back the Japanese islands and turn them into Japanese province, right? There are designs on the Ryukyus for sure, and there's people, nationalists, that think Japan belongs to China too. And then last one, reassure allies and partners through presence. And this goes to that one-way gate in the Straits of Malacca. Stop solving all the world's problems with Indo-PACOM resources and make that a policy. That stuff becomes fixed, and let's build out where Indo-PACOM is, because that's a message of reassurance to Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and all the others that we really are here to stay. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that excellent overview, David. A lot here to think about, and I will go back to asking a question about how ways we can deter the deterrence lessons from Ukraine for Taiwan. Our next speaker is Miles Yu. Miles?
Thank you, Glenn, and for inviting me, and very glad to be here to be able to share my thoughts with this august body of audience. This country went through 4 years of Russia, and we thought that we would have a break. So in March of this year, Mike Pompeo and I landed in Taiwan, and this is about 10 days after the invasion of Ukraine, and again, it's Russia. Every day we're there is all about Ukraine and Russia. So Russia and Rodina is everywhere. So it's pretty amazing. But I'll tell you what. I'm going to basically share some thoughts, random thoughts rather, with you in four aspects. And first of all, the question is, why did Taiwan react so violently and so sort of excitedly, if that's a word, to Ukraine? Obviously, the question is, people draw the necessary connection between Ukraine and invaded by Russia and Taiwan to be invaded by mainland China. And then I'll tell you something else. Right after Taiwan, Pompeo and I went to Singapore. And anybody knows Singapore. Singapore is the master of walking a tightrope, diplomatic tightrope, basically trying not to piss off any major player. So they always walk very diplomatic mastery in that regard. But this time is different. Singapore reacted very, very clearly with no ambiguity whatsoever. It was the first Asian country to sanction Russia. And it was very, very powerful. We asked them why, and they said it's very simple. Because 85% of Singaporeans were ethnic Chinese. And you draw the connection. So the first thing I would like to say is how fundamentally Russia's war in Ukraine have changed their gameplay, doctrinally and tactically. The reason is very simple. It's basically, it's sort of the epic struggle between the new civilization states versus the Westphalian nation states. What Russia's justification for invading Ukraine is exactly the same justification China has been saying for years. That is, it's not sovereignty is interpreted not as defined by international law, by mutual agreement of border dispute settlements, rather by shared ethno-linguistic legacy. Wherever the people speaking Russian and a civilization state like Russia should have the right to rule over that. And this is exactly why people in Singapore, why people in Taiwan, which is 95% ethnic Chinese, reacted so violently. So that's the reason why this Russian invasion of Ukraine is not an incidental matter. It's a triumph of a very pernicious philosophy of international diplomacy, that is civilization state. Now, you know, any of you in academia, you will know the phrase civilization state first was coined by scholars to describe China. The idea of Greater China, remember, in the 1990s, very popular. By extension, anybody who speaks Chinese should be under Chinese rule. Not only Taiwan, Singapore, but also Chinatown in San Francisco could be considered that. So this is a very dangerous and a pernicious theory that actually went on for years and years. And now we can see Russia put that into practice. This is why doctrinal connection between Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's invasion of Taiwan is right there. And that's very clear to a lot of people in Taiwan. So that's one aspect I want to talk about, share with you. Second aspect is the Ukraine war actually sort of change a little bit of the whole idea of alliance. You know, people in Taiwan were shocked by the fact that there was a kind of a very sharp irony dichotomy. On the one hand, there's a tremendous moral support for Ukrainians. I mean, Taiwanese, I've never seen him so motivated to support one country. I mean, from the head of state all the way to the neighborhood community, everybody is motivated to help Ukrainians. On the other hand, you know, from the very beginning of the conflict, major democracies declared no military involvement whatsoever in Ukraine. President Biden, the first thing he said that no U.S. military involvement in Ukraine whatsoever. NATO said the same thing. Now, this is a pretty big dichotomy, right? So what this means to Taiwan is this. That is, you know, you cannot really rely 100% on allies' help in a time of national crisis. Now, that is a pretty big psychological realization. You know, everyone who goes to Taiwan, you know that the Americans' military support is crucial. So I think deep inside the Taiwanese high command, there might be some kind of thinking that, you know what, not necessarily. We got to be really rely upon ourselves, like the Israelis do. We welcome allied support, but first and foremost, our national defense must be based upon our own ability to defend ourselves. I think that's a very big psychological change. Dialectically, I hate to use this word because it's pretty like, you know, Marxist-Leninist, but dialectically, it's also worked the same way. If you do not have a resolve for national self-defense, if you don't have the national mobilization to defend yourself like the Israelis, international alliance, no matter how strong that may be, will mean nothing. If Zelensky did not stand up as a beacon of hope and courage, Ukraine probably would have been another Afghanistan. So that's why it's very important. You have to base your own national defense on yourself first and foremost. So that, I think, is changing quite a bit, you know, doctrinally in the whole idea of alliance. On the other hand, this naked invasion of Ukraine also shocked a lot of people in Asia-Pacific as well. The reason why the war is so limited in Ukraine is because of the existence of NATO, right? Even though NATO didn't really sort of deter this, but the fact that, you know, there's a Kaliningrad, there's also a lot of small countries who like to piss off Russia royally. Poland, all the countries. And the reason why they're not being invaded is because of the collective defense arrangement. So that's why many countries in Asia Pacific have seen the merits, the virtue, if not absolute necessity, of collective multilateral defense system, and which does not exist in Asia Pacific. America's alliance system in Asia Pacific is predominantly, I would say exclusively, bilateral, not multilateral. We have a very good bilateral defense arrangement with Japan, with Korea, with the Philippines, but not amongst ourselves. So that's why many countries are now changing in a very big way. On one hand, NATO, in search of its own mission, has set up its rhetoric about peace and stability in Asia Pacific, which the Chinese government is really nervous about right now. On the other hand, countries like Australia and Japan in particular were really sort of moving very close to NATO. I mean, Prime Minister of Japan for the first time ever is now going to a NATO summit, which is a pretty amazing thing. Think about that, right? So I think in the foreseeable future, there will be some kind of a talking built upon this idea of a NATO model to create some kind of multilateral defense arrangement. Quad, AUKUS, whatever you call it. But the best way is actually to expand NATO to Asia Pacific, if that's all possible, right? Because what we're seeing here is a formation of a massive Euro-Asian continental threat. Russia and China are getting closer together, not only rhetorically, politically, diplomatically, but also militarily. Remember, last day of President Biden's trip to Tokyo a few weeks ago was met with a send-off from a joint Russian-Chinese bomber patrol in the state of Japan. That's a common threat. If there's a common threat faced by not only European countries, but also Asian countries, there should be a common response. And that is the argument, in my view, for the formation, at least the discussion, of a North Atlantic Indo-Pacific Treaty Organization, NIPTO. So that's the a scenario, hopefully, situation will move inward that way. So that's alliance. Another thing that I think Taiwan in particular should really learn from the Ukrainian is the lesson that never should trust any kind of agreement with China. Ukraine and China are very, very close for 20-some years. Chinese military modernization in the last 2.5 decades would not have been possible without Ukraine's massive infusion of Russian-designed next-generation weapons, from aircraft carrier to heavy bomber engines to air cushion landing crafts to missile technology. And it's all from Ukraine at a fraction of the price the Russians would have charged. So we have over 2,000 Ukrainian Russian-trained weapons experts right now in China. We're talking about like in the last 20 years, and it's always there. So because many in the Ukrainian elites have this illusion that somehow there's a third way. We don't want to go to Brussels, over to Brussels. We don't want to go to Moscow. We can go to Beijing way. So that's why there have been so many, several very big treaties, strategic partnership treaties signed between Kiev and Beijing. The most significant of which was signed in December 2013, when Viktor Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, went to Beijing, signed a nuclear pledge agreement with China, through which China pledged to provide nuclear umbrella to Ukraine in case Ukraine is under attack by a third country, nuclear. And that's Russia, right? So this is pretty amazing. But the moment that Russia basically invaded Ukraine in 2014 and now China basically abandoned Ukraine, there's no friendship whatsoever. So Russia become the big brother again. So I will just end one final thought, that is the war in Ukraine tactically is also very important. You got to find this critical mass weapon. Javelin is important. and Taiwan buy a lot of money, a lot of weapons from U.S., but you had to find the one that really would make a fundamental difference. You know, the largest amphibious battle the PLA ever launched, and also a big failure, was in October 1914 against Taiwan, in the beach of Gunintou, right? The Battle of Quemoy, and China failed because of one killer weapon by the KMT defenders. That is the 25 very old-fashioned American World War II vintage Stuart tanks. That's what destroyed the landing craft of PLA. So
That was what year?
That was 1949.
Thank you very much. That is an excellent, I'm going to come back to some questions you hit upon. And Michael, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Glenn. While the Russia-Ukraine war is very different in many ways from a potential China-Taiwan conflict, there's also lots of lessons that can be gleaned from it. Glenn asked me to talk about some of those, the lessons for U.S. military and intelligence policy and strategy. So I'm going to do that, ranging from deterrence, intelligence assessment, and then strategy, operations, and tactics. So before I do that, let me start with the causes of the war, and Miles hit on this, so I'll go through it quickly. Russia-Ukraine war was not the inevitable result of NATO expansion. If anything, it's a result of too little NATO expansion. It's not because Ukraine posed an unacceptable threat to Russia's security. The only threat it posed was really its growing Western orientation, and that a democratic, successful Ukraine and Western-oriented Ukraine would set a real bad example for Russia that the Russian people might take notice of, and with implications for Putin's authoritarian regime. And of course, it's not because Ukraine is ruled by Nazis or is engaged in genocide against its Russian-speaking population. The primary cause of the war is that Putin doesn't believe, as Miles said, that Ukraine should exist as an independent state and should be reincorporated into Russia. And this ought to sound really familiar to Taiwanese. This world would not be unfamiliar to the great Athenian statesman Thucydides. You know, recall in the history of the Peloponnesian War, he has this Melian dialogue where the island of Melos wants to switch sides during the war from Athens to Sparta, and the Athenians tell him you can't do that, and they crush the resistance. And the line that Thucydides says about this is, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And that applies to Russia and China. So let me now turn to deterrence. Our new national defense strategy, which builds on the one from 2018, has as its central pillar integrated deterrence. Well, it goes without saying, I think as Miles said, that deterrence failed, integrated or otherwise, in Russia, Ukraine. Several reasons for this. I'll offer 6 or 7. The first is that Putin was on a roll. You know, he hadn't been deterred throughout his 20-some year rule in various ways, beginning with the Second Chechnya War, but then limited invasion of Georgia in 2008, invasion of Ukraine, both overtly and covertly, in 2014, intervention in Syria in 2015, intervention in U.S. Presidential elections in 2016 and 2020. His belief is that the U.S. and West are weak. The Afghanistan debacle reinforced that for him, and that he had the West by the proverbial short hairs in terms of energy dependence. Xi's belief is very similar, that the West is weak and in decline as well. Miles also talked about, and I think General Stillwell did as well, and Senator Cotton this morning, about President Biden's statements that the U.S. wouldn't intervene in the event of a Russian invasion. This is like Dean Acheson and Korea in 1950, declaring that Korea was outside our defense perimeter. And of course, as Senator Cotton mentioned this morning, there were no countervailing U.S. force moves to counter the Russian buildups. The threat of sanctions didn't deter Russia. You can argue we did military assistance to Ukraine in the last 8 years, but not enough to build up their defenses before the war in the way we've done since the war began. And has been noted, Ukraine lacked any real allies. Key lesson is that deterrence must be backed by the credible threat of force, or at least that has to be in doubt. A second lesson is that more important for China-Taiwan is that the fate of deterrence will depend on how the Russia-Ukraine war turns out. If Russia prevails, deterrence will be substantially weakened. If Ukraine wins and Russia is substantially weakened, deterrence will be strengthened. So let me now turn to some intelligence lessons. According to press reporting, U.S. intelligence did very well regarding Putin's intentions to invade Ukraine and topple the Zelensky government. It also did very well in uncovering several Russian false flag plots that were intended to provide justification for the war. Where the U.S. intelligence community did not do as well, however, was in assessing Russian and Ukrainian capabilities, expecting a rapid Russian conquest. The only saving grace for the United States that Russian intelligence performed far worse. So what do you take from this? I mean, usually it's harder to discern intentions than capabilities. There's lots of ways to determine capabilities. So how did we get it wrong? Well, one lesson is that militaries are more than hardware and doctrine. You know, the Russians love to say, yeah, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? You know, and they're very good at military thought. They're not quite so good at operations, and despite a decade of modernization, they seem to have gotten worse. A second key lesson, and it's been touched on already, is that national will to fight is really a critical variable in how a conflict evolves. A third is the importance of open source intelligence. You know, every Ukrainian in this conflict is a censor of one kind or another, and that volume of intelligence, particularly in the early stages, has played a critical role in shaping global perceptions of the conflict. You know, it's informed U.S. and allied policy, but we have lots of other means of doing that, but it really informs a lot of the world, which what you see on a daily basis. But leveraging open source intelligence is not enough. Stealing an adversary's secrets through a variety of means is still essential. It's essential in Russia-Ukraine. It'll be essential in any China-Taiwan conflict. Now, I would add that, you know, China may make similar errors in intelligence judgments in the way Russia did in expecting a rapid and easy conquest of Taiwan. You know, its military, after all, hasn't fought a war since 1979, and it didn't do all that well then. And how the PLA would perform and how much Taiwanese resistance China can expect ought to be weighing heavily on Xi Jinping. So let me now turn to strategy, operations, and tactics. So the most important strategy lesson of the Russia-Ukraine war is about escalation and the imperative not to cede escalation dominance to your adversary. What is escalation? You know, it's a ladder of capabilities going from, in a conventional war, from conventional war to potentially widening of the conflict, it's called horizontal escalation, and then to strategic attack means, now including cyber, but principally nuclear weapons. We've had to deal with the escalation risk through the Cold War, but seem to have forgotten a lot of these important lessons, including that you can't cede escalation dominance to your adversary. It's unnecessarily constrained the U.S. and Western response in terms of weapons we've provided. And, you know, I reluctantly would say that we've been engaged more in self-deterrence than we have in actual deterrence. Now, this lesson, I would add, applies not just to a potential China-Taiwan conflict or any conflict with a nuclear power, North Korea, potentially Iran someday, but also a Russian attack on NATO. You know, Russia's core element of Russia's strategy is escalate to de-escalate, and you would see a similar thing, I think, in a China-Taiwan conflict. General Stillwell has already covered this, so I'll just mention it and move on. Second lesson is the importance of allies, the more the better, and collective defense. You see this in Europe in the frontline states, less so in major NATO members, which is a concern. You know, Winston Churchill said, you know, the only worse thing than fighting with allies is fighting without them. So let me now turn to the indecisiveness of non-military instruments in Russia, Ukraine. You know, partially this is a result of incomplete application, you know, continuing to buy Russian energy that funds Putin war machine. You know, it's a strange war when you're funding and fighting your adversary at the same time. But also important is the economic spillover effects from globalization. You know, global food supplies are being affected as much as energy by the war, and other critical materials are as well. A China-Taiwan conflict, if protracted, could have even greater effects on the global economy, combining the effects that we've seen. You know, if you look at the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and supply chain shortages in Russia-Ukraine war, that's what you might get in any protracted conflict with China. And then a final critical strategic lesson I've already touched on a bit is the importance of national will. This rallies international support up to your side, and it also buys time for allies in a China-Taiwan conflict, the United States, to prepare an effective response. So let me now conclude by talking a little bit about operational and tactical lessons. And there are several of these. The first is that the Chinese and Russian approach to war is similar in some respects in that it's a war on societies and not just on armed forces. Populations and critical infrastructure are targeted with both kinetic and non-kinetic means, and it's the conventional equivalent of what we talk about in the nuclear world of counter-value as well as counter-force strategies. The second lesson is that is recognizing that great power wars are also wars of society in other respects as well. Military stockpiles and industrial mobilization capacity are looming large in the Russia-Ukraine war, and they would if a China-Taiwan conflict became protracted as well. And they're likely to be critical variables in determining a conflict's outcome. You know, how the United States, the arsenal of democracy in World War II, and its allies in the West can outproduce Russia over time is beyond me, but right now that is in doubt. A related lesson to this is the importance of pre-conflict preparation, strengthening, hardening the defenses of your ally. It's called a porcupine defense, and then having robust supply lines in a war. So Ukraine is really blessed with very robust supply lines, may not have been prepared as well as it could. But Taiwan would be in a very different situation as an island state, and so what you do before the war will really matter dramatically, even more so than in Ukraine. Third lesson is the importance of territorial defense. Senator Cotton talked about reserves that can combine what the Russians call hybrid warfare, but irregular warfare tactics and mobilization of the population with conventional defense. This will be just as important in Taiwan, and particularly in buying time and making any occupation difficult as it is in Ukraine. Fourth lesson is the importance of precision weaponry. Miles talked about javelins and stingers that are used for small unit tactics. Also major artillery duels. Precision matters there as well. That's the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system that we're just starting to supply. And I would add that quantity has a quality all its own. The numbers of these systems matter. So it's fine to say we've supplied 6,500 javelins. If we're supplying a handful of HIMARS rather than many tens of HIMARS, we're going to have trouble in eastern Ukraine. So generally we've done well in small arms supply, but have not done as well in the quantity and quality of heavy weapons, particularly rocket artillery and advanced air defenses and ammunition. Now, a key difference between Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan is how well prepared the U.S. military will be to repel a Chinese attack. You can be sure, I think it's been mentioned earlier, a key lesson that Xi and the PLA will take from Russia's failure to rapidly take Kyiv and overthrow the Zelensky government is the need to use concentrated, overwhelming force against Taipei. A China-Taiwan conflict would likely extend into space in the early stages, as well as cyberspace. I like to say space superiority is to 21st century conflict what air superiority was to 20th century conflict. The U.S. military's ability to respond quickly and decisively in the face of Chinese anti-access aerial denial capabilities will also be critical. U.S. needs to leverage its strengths in space cyber, long-range air power and fires, undersea warfare, and autonomous systems far more than it's doing at present, and it must do so in a hurry. In the near term, when your options are more constrained, it needs to significantly expand its stock of long-range precision-guided munitions that would complicate any invasion force. Now, I want to emphasize that war with China over Taiwan is not inevitable, but it will become far more likely if Putin prevails in Ukraine and if the U.S. fails to transform its force posture in East Asia. And then finally, I think as Miles noted, we can't rule out having to face a two-front war if China attacks Taiwan. You know, a Russian attempt to seize the Baltic states, despite the overtaxed and weakened state of the Russian military, cannot be ruled out. When dictators say stuff like Northern Europe really is Russian and Narva and all that stuff, you ought to pay attention. They usually mean it when they say it. And Putin's made it clear he has them in his sights as well. With that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very, very thoughtful and detailed assessment and recommendations, contrasting and comparing these differences. I think Miles hit on a point that I'd like to pick up on about national will and determination. I mean, a lot of people talk about Taiwan's ability to defend itself, and Senator Cotton this morning highlighted the need for asymmetric means to be able, for a small state like Taiwan, to be able to counter a larger adversary. And we've heard a lot of different dimensions here in this conversation. Miles talked about the need for that China and Russia are basically continental powers, opposed to NATO, which is more of a maritime alliance of states. But you've also have a situation where you have a very powerful ally like Japan that is an ally of, and can be an ally in helping deter China. The analogy is with Poland. Poland is stepping in with secure supply lines to provide things to Ukraine. So, but as General Stillwell pointed out last night, there's 100 miles of water between China and Taiwan. So, you know, the question is, can the dragon swim? So, I think there's a lot of things in here, and I appreciate all this very thoughtful ideas. And this won't be the last conversation on this topic. I think our purpose today was to kind of make people think about the Ukraine-Russia war, what it means for Taiwan. And there's all these things we got to think through and think about. And I'd like to open up the floor to some questions. If you have those, I'm sure there's plenty of questions that people have. You know, I guess one of the things I'm kind of looming in my mind is just this ability for the United States. You know, you don't, as Miles said, you really need a NATO in the Pacific and in Asia, but you don't, and then different states have different views. Whereas in Europe, you have a NATO. So you have all these 20 different countries providing supplies to Ukraine, and then how is Taiwan going to get its supplies? I mean, it's a maritime issue of great importance, but does Taiwan have the ability to hold out, and what are the slocks and all that? That's a larger discussion. But I guess as we're seeing ammunition shortages show up inside of Ukraine and the need to supply, it's becoming a huge issue. And so anyone have any questions? Challenge some of our presenters today? Do you want to comment? Man and gentleman in the back, you were first right out of the chute with your hand up, so I'll give you the question.
I want to congratulate you. This has been an excellent conference. And one of the things I haven't
Who
heard,
are you?
Stephen Schrage, Johns Hopkins SAIS. One of the things I haven't heard addressed in real depth was the current assessment of what is Taiwan's capacity to repel an invasion. And the things I've seen publicly have been pretty grim about their current state of force readiness and the like. And so I think that raises two questions building on some of the things that have been out there. One is, do you share that assessment of them currently not being capable in those regards, particularly their forces and training? And if so, how has it gotten to that point given the things that you've spoken about the Trump administration making a number of welcome changes to kind of see this more as an open war conflict with China? And then secondly, how do you change that if you do have that assessment, given also realizing the context that was raised in the earlier panel of a lot of the lessons that China may be raising from the Ukraine experience is that if Russia had struck it earlier as it did in Crimea before there was time to prepare, they might have had more success.
Go ahead.
I can start,
whoever.
sir, you're the intel guy.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, all I'll say on that is these things are always more difficult than they seem, and we thought Ukraine was going to get walked over, and they did just fine. And then Taiwan, snapshots don't work. I think trends work. And if you look at where Taiwan was 10 years ago and where they are today, that is significantly better. And the fact that they just published civil defense rules on what you're going to do if there's an invasion, again, that tells them it's serious, and that's a message to Beijing to say it won't be a walk in the park.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a mixed bag in a sense that, one, in a lot of trends in warfare have really favored the defense. And, we see that tactical level in Ukraine and et cetera. Territorial defense, civil defense would be very, very important in Taiwan as it is in Ukraine, particularly if they're well equipped and organized. And so I think that's a big task for President Tsai. One of the challenges Taiwan face, I think, is that the same challenges that have affected the U.S. military in terms of anti-access aerial denial, the ability to hit fixed targets on the surface, whether on land or at the sea, also applies to any state within range of those weapons, and particularly a state with not a strong infrastructure. So the balance between long-range precision weapons that you can move very quickly, shoot and scoot like HIMARS versus aircraft and fixed bunkers, ought to be looked at in terms of making the defense more resilient, but and then to counter any invasion. Mines, a lot of asymmetric capabilities would probably work better than symmetrical ones. Pause there.
I cannot comment on the specific tactical ambiguity, which is very important, obviously. But I do know that PRC has a strategic predicament in a Taiwan scenario. That is this. If anti-access area denial is the game, and that means they're going to deny United States and allies to get to Taiwan once the first shot was fired. If they do that, and the only way they could do that is strike American bases in Okinawa and the Philippines and Guam, and that would present a very serious predicament. That is, if U.S. forces were strike, and then mainland target will be legitimate for the United States as well. So, to what degree they would like to risk that, and I think that's the predicament they have to deal with. In the larger scheme of things, and I think logistics, ammunition supply, and those things are very important. And I might also add coastal defense in many ways. What is the ultimate goal? I mean, joint fire strike is not really the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to get your boots on the ground in Taiwan. I think there are many, many ways we could do to stop that. I'll just leave that.
Good point. Professor Waldron, can you wait for the microphone, please?
I'm sorry.
Thanks very much. I really have a comment, which is that
Make it short.
I understand errors in policy, strategy, tactics, and whatnot often have their origins in mistaken academic understandings of history. And in the course of this current struggle, it struck me that the ultimate culprit is the triumph in American universities of Cold War revisionism. That is the idea that the reason that the Soviet Union became an enemy had to do with a whole series of mistakes that we had made which irritated Stalin or irritated the Russians. and we were unwilling to come to grips with the fact that the Soviets had their own ideology and they could think for themselves. Likewise, in the case of China, it really wasn't until very recently, and Professor Yu had something to do with this, that the last chance in China theory, which said really the communists wanted to be our buddies, no Chinese could really be a communist, and if we'd just been a little bit nicer to them, then everything would be sweetness and light over there. Even the leading Cold War specialists, such as Professor Vestad at Harvard now, they buy into this. And I am constantly encountering Cold War revisionism as the framing understanding for international conflict. Cold War revisionism is wrong. That's not why we had the Cold War. It wasn't caused by the United States. We're not fighting proxy wars using the Europeans. It's much, much simpler. It has to do with despotisms trying to extend, as Professor Yu is pointing out, with this concept of cultural rather than international legal definitions. And not much I can do except fight Cold War revisionism, and we should all do that. Thank you very much.
Glenn, can I add one?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
certainly.
I agree with Arthur about erroneous views of the Cold War. I would add, too, if you take a longer range view of history, China's turn is not, it's the norm. And, they were actually a big partner of ours in the late Cold War. So there's at least this tiny kernel of truth that we had better relations in the late Cold War than we have progressively since. But if you look at history, when one empire collapses, like the Soviet Empire, and you have a couple left, the one that was banded together often then, if their power increases, then becomes more of a rival. You see this with Britain and Germany, allied against France and then becoming enemies, Soviet Union and the United States, et cetera. It's a long-standing pattern, as well as the challenge that as states accrue more power and their political systems matter enormously, they tend to do stuff with it. So we shouldn't be shocked by, we would be shocked by the reverse.
Arthur, thank you for this kind of words. And I will say this, I think, we have been sitting in Washington, D.C., we always have the sense that we're the center of global diplomacy, and the U.S. move the finger and the world will move a little bit accordingly. We always been very smart about our capability to play the China card for some other geostrategic purposes, either defeat the Soviet Union, get us out of Vietnam War, or deal with the nuclear issue in North Korea. Well, in fact, has always been, the Chinese Communist Party has played the U.S. card much, much more successfully than we play the China card. And because of many reasons, but one of them is very important, that is, they have an absolute ideological consistency from beginning. It doesn't really matter which party is in power in Washington, D.C., hawks or doves, Republicans, Democrats. What ultimately matters is the very existence of the United States, because the biggest fear of the Chinese Communist Party is not the United States, it's the Chinese people liking the American system. That's why America poses a mortal threat to the very foundation of the regime, regardless of who is in charge. So all this sort of, back and forth, shadow boxing about, hawks in D.C., those provocative warmongers like Pompeo, and it's just total nonsense. So that's why, if you read Reagan's diary, President Reagan's diary. President Reagan was one of the few political leaders who really has little illusion about the reformers versus the heartlanders inside the Communist Party. The person he liked the least is the party General Secretary Hu Yaobang, who's been held as the hero of Chinese communist reform because he thought Hu Yaobang was totally ideological, totally hostile to the United States as a model. And this is why I think George Kennan got it right about Soviet Union in 1946-47. And he interpreted correctly the source of Soviet conduct is not just conduct itself. Soviet Union was aggressive all across Europe. There's Iron Curtain coming down. But he understood the reason why it was that. It was a communist ideology. It was the Leninistic understanding of the epic struggle in the world between two systems of governance, socialism versus capitalism. That's why if you read the Chinese Communist Party documents, fundamentally it's about that. It absolutely boggles my mind, day in and day out. Our mainstream media, our academia, do not focus on that part of party ideology, the source of Chinese Communist Party conduct, rather than focusing on their action here and there and there.
One final question, and then we're going to call it a day. Going once, going twice. Thank you very much for participating in this conference today. The video will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards, and you'll be able to watch it and share it with all your friends. We thank you and look forward to seeing you again. Have a good day.
Excellent time.
We did it.
We did. Glen, I just forwarded the article to answer your question about that 1949 amphibious battle.
That's a great. What tank was it?
Stewart.
It was Stewart.
Stewart is one of the least.
Yeah, that's what I was like. I wanted to make sure. I thought
It's antique.
maybe you said Sherman tank.
No, Stewart. It's an antique. They had 25 of them. They didn't know what to do with it. And then when they
What, they were on the beaches and they used them?
they're
or-
doing beach patrol.